Research has shown that beer in ancient Egypt was at least as prevalent, if not more so, than beer in modern America. Used as a form of payment, one literally took home a six-pack, or more accurately a 6-liter jug, of beer each day after work. Thirsty for lunch? Have a beer. Dehydrated after building a pyramid? Crack open a cold one. Don't know what to feed the kid alongside his loaf of bread? How about a nice ale? Or perhaps a lager? Heading down to the religious festival? Don't forget the cooler. Because it is often purer than water and had significant nutrients, beer was as much a staple in ancient Egyptian culture and diet as something like bread. And as a result, it's often easy for us to identify with the beer drinking culture of ancient Egypt. When it comes to other drugs, however, the Egyptian evidence is far more murky. Whereas the war on drugs became a familiar phrase in America during the 1980s and 90s, and debates about the legalization of marijuana have headlined recent discussions across the United States, the use of drugs other than alcohol in ancient Egypt is still hotly debated. In this lecture, we'll dive into those debates, examine the evidence on both sides, and see what conclusions we can draw. In doing so, we'll look at a wide variety of ways the ancient archaeological evidence can be interpreted, and start thinking of the implications of those archaeological findings. To start, we'll look at some of the drugs that we have fairly good evidence for, where most scholars agree about their presence and use in ancient Egypt. And then we'll move towards some of the more contested drugs and see how the evidence compares. Our most concrete evidence for the use of drugs in ancient Egypt comes from the realm of medicine. Now, the way medicine was practiced in ancient Egypt resembled the way that medicine was practiced in much of the pre-modern world. It was a combination of science and religion, and much of what was done to treat ailments was as likely to do harm as to help and heal. Nevertheless, the Egyptians did make some serious strides in the field, not the least of which was the ability to preserve the body after death, the process we all know as mummification. While mummification might not have saved the actual individual being wrapped up, it did give the Egyptians an in-depth look into the internal structure and organs of the human body. Our evidence for medicine in ancient Egypt comes from a wide variety of sources: wall paintings in tombs and temples, the archaeological remains of medical instruments, written accounts in historical and literary texts, and the well-preserved biological remains of Egyptian mummies. Egyptian doctors were often part of the priesthood and trained within a temple where medical texts were kept and copied for future generations. Within these texts, we see a wide variety of levels within medicine. You could be a simple physician, an overseer of physicians, a palace physician, an inspector of physicians, or several other varieties. And we see specialization, with some being ophthalmologists, others focusing on internal disease, and still others focusing on dentistry. It's yet to be determined, however, whether there were anti-dentites like Seinfeld prominent in ancient Egyptian culture.
So you won't believe what happened with Watley today. It got back to him that I made this little dentist joke, and he got all offended. Those people can be so touchy.
Those people. Listen to yourself.
What?
You think that dentists are so different from me and you? They came to this country just like everybody else in search of a dream.
Watley's from Jersey.
Yes, and now he's a full-fledged American.
Kramer, he's just a dentist.
Yeah, and you're an anti-dentite.
I am not an anti-dentite.
You're a rabid anti-dentite. Oh, it starts with a few jokes and some slurs. Hey, Denty! Next thing you know, you're saying they should have their own schools.
They do have their own schools.
Closely linked to this medical infrastructure were the gods of ancient Egypt. No, not those gods. The hawk god Horus was known as the divine physician, while Thoth was the god of healing and science. The warrior lioness Sekhmet, in addition to being a prominent part of beer mythology in Egypt, served as the goddess of disease. And even Imhotep, the architect of the first ever pyramid, was later deified and became somewhat of a healing saint. So if you're going under the knife for surgery, it was as important to be good with the gods as it was to get a good physician. The most specific details of how people were treated come from a series of papyri, an ancient form of paper made from the stalks of reeds. It's actually where we get our word paper from, that contain information about both diagnoses and treatment. The most famous of these is known as the Smith Surgical Papyrus, named for an American adventurer, Edwin Smith, who bought the papyrus in Egypt in 1862, which discusses diseases in a top-down form. Quote unquote, if you're examining someone with blank, then they have got blank. The doctor then goes on to say how likely it is that this person will survive. Either he will treat the disease, that's the best prognosis, or he will contend with the disease, meaning you've got a fighting chance, or the ailment won't be treated. Bad news for you. An example of the treatable injury from the papyrus is as follows. If you examine a man having a break in his upper arm, and you find his upper arm hanging down, separated from its joint, you should say, "You have a break in your upper arm, an ailment which I will treat." You should place him on his back, with something folded between his two shoulder blades. You should spread out his shoulders in order to stretch apart his upper arm until that break falls into its place. You should make for him 2 splints of linen, and apply one of them to the inside of his arm, and the other of them to the underside of the arm. You should bind it with yemeru, and treat afterward with honey every day until he recovers. If you go in with a gaping wound in your head and a smashed skull, however, you're a little less lucky, as can be seen in the following diagnosis. Case 5. If you examine a man having a gaping wound in his head, penetrating to the bone, and smashing his skull, thou should palpate the wound. If you find that smash is deep in his skull and sunken under his fingers, while the swelling over it protrudes, he discharges blood from both his nostrils and both his ears, and he suffers with stiffness in his neck so that he's unable to look at his 2 shoulders and his chest. You should say to him, "You have a gaping wound in your head that's penetrating to the bone, and a smashed skull, and you suffer from stiffness in the neck. This is an ailment that's not to be treated." You should not bind him, but tie him up to mooring stakes until the period of injury passes by. Yikes. Remind me not to get a gaping wound in my head and a smashed skull next time I'm traveling in ancient Egypt. Most of the treatments are physical or mechanical. Bandage the arm, put a splint on the leg, just stay in bed for a few days. But some recommend specific material treatments, like honey and copper salts for open wounds. Somewhat amazingly, these have actually been shown to reduce bacterial infection among modern scientific experiments. Okay, enough broken bones. Let's get to the mind-altering substances. Because it's primarily focused on external injuries, the Smith Papyrus doesn't do much for our understanding of drugs in the ancient world. Luckily, however, the same scribe who copied the Smith Papyrus also copied another one that's become known as the Ebers Papyrus. Originally purchased by the same Edwin Smith discussed above, and sold to Egyptologist George Ebers 10 years later, the Ebers Papyrus suggests a series of herbal, plant, and drug-like treatments for internal diseases and wounds. Acacia, for example, could be used to ease diarrhea. Aloe vera, just like today, was used to treat burns. Juniper could be used to soothe cramping. And garlic could help you with your flatulence. We know that some of these treatments, like the aloe vera mentioned above, could actually work. But I think it's a bit of a stretch to consider any of these normal herbs and plants as drugs or mind-altering substances, even though they certainly did have some effect on the mind and the way one felt. That boundary between common plant and psychoactive drug changes dramatically when we get to the poppy plant. The poppy plant, of course, is the source of the drug opium, which can then be refined into morphine. The poppy plant, from which opium is derived, is known by the Latin term Papaver somniferum, quite literally, the poppy that brings sleep. And in addition to being a sedative, opium works as a pain reducer as well. The active ingredient in the poppy flower, the part used to make opium, comes from the unripe bulb, which looks similar to a pomegranate. This bulb or capsule is then carefully sliced open, and the goo that starts oozing out, officially known as the latex, is what constitutes opium. In fact, the whole word opium is derived from the Greek word opos, which means vegetable juice. And so when you hear the Meisters on Game of Thrones talk about the milk of the poppy, they're really referring to opium, juice that flows out of the unripe poppy capsule when it's carefully sliced open.
Mr. Pycelle was giving him milk of the poppy.
Give him milk of the poppy.
You'll need milk of the poppy.
Raw opium contains a number of alkaloids, which are special chemicals with profound effects. The most prevalent of these alkaloids within raw opium is morphine, which suppresses pain and brings sleep. As with the Latin name for the plant, morphine also makes etymological sense. It is named after the Greek god Morpheus, the god of dreams, which is what will quickly come when you take the drug morphine. The poppy flower is grown over large swaths of Eurasia, from Greece and Turkey in the west to China and India in the east. And its record of its uses goes back about 5,000 years, where it's documented in Sumerian cuneiform tablets. While it wasn't indigenous to Egypt, the Ebers Papyrus, as well as archaeological depictions and botanical remains, suggest that the poppy was indeed used in ancient Egypt for psychoactive purposes, especially in magic and medicine. The Ebers Papyrus mentions something known as shepping as part of the remedy for a crying child. The treatment goes as follows. A remedy for too much crying in a child. Sheppen seeds, fly dung from the wall, is made into a paste, mixed with water, strained and drunk for 4 days. The crying will cease immediately. This certainly sounds like the seeds of poppy flower with its pain-killing and sleep-inducing properties. In addition to the Ebers Papyrus, we have archaeological evidence of actual morphine as well. The tomb of Ka, dating to the New Kingdom and located at Deir el-Medina, a site famous for being the settlement that housed the workers who built the Valley of the Kings, yielded a small stone vessel. Inside that vessel was an oily substance, which chemical analysis confirmed contained morphine. Amazingly, the morphine hadn't lost its potency. And when it was tested on a frog and mouse, it put them to sleep. And when it was placed under the skin of another frog, it killed it. Although these results are somewhat dubious because they couldn't be produced in a second analysis in a different lab. We also have iconographic evidence of the presence of poppies in ancient Egypt. The tomb of Senedjem clearly shows a group of red poppies among several other plants and flowers. Elaborate gold earrings from the tomb of Queen Tauzret, dating to the 19th dynasty of the New Kingdom, also show poppies. In the dynasty later, the famous pharaoh Tutankhamun was buried with dried poppies as part of his embalming cache. Finally, the stela of a woman named Taperet, showing a devotional offering scene, appears to show a budding poppy flower about to burst open in the bottom left-hand corner of the scene. In addition to the historical and archaeological evidence from Pharaonic Egypt, the later Greeks and Romans clearly thought that the Egyptians utilized opium, at least for medical and magical purposes. In a famous scene from Homer's Odyssey, the Egyptian queen Polydamna gives Helen of Troy a mysterious potion called Nepenthes, which literally translates to no sorrow or no pain, which could be put into wine to erase all painful memories. Homer goes on to tell of how Nepenthes was grown in the fields of Egypt. Was it opium, morphine? If so, it would be further evidence of Egypt growing poppies as early as the 8th century BC. The Roman author Pliny also noted the growing and use of poppies in Egypt, but he wasn't writing until the Romans ruled Egypt, 1,200 years after the New Kingdom. Interesting side note, Pliny the Elder was a natural historian who actually died while he was recording the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. And nowadays he's got his own beer named after him, Pliny the Elder, a double IPA brewed by the Russian River Brewing Company, which has won the Best Beer in the World award several different times. While all this evidence suggests the use of psychoactive properties of the poppy plant in ancient Egypt, debate still remains. Some of these concern the date of its use. Most scholars acknowledge the use of opium by the time of the New Kingdom, but others say that it goes back much further, all the way to the Old Kingdom, while others say that Papaver somniferum wasn't introduced until the Greeks took over Egypt. A similar debate occurs about the type of poppy. Most scholars acknowledge that there were at least two types of poppy in use in ancient Egypt. The pink poppy, or Papaver somniferum, also known as the opium poppy, and the red poppy, or Papaver roeas, whose narcotic effects exist but are far more mild. What scholars disagree on is when these different varieties came into play in Egypt, and what they were used for, medicine, magic, or recreation. What does seem clear is that the poppy was used from the New Kingdom on to treat pain in ancient Egypt. And while the details may be debated, it certainly qualifies as Egyptian use of a mind-altering substance. The other plant that's frequently depicted in Egyptian art and literature that had psychoactive effects is the blue lotus. Known by the Latin name Nymphaea cerulea, the blue lotus was a type of lily that opened with bright colors during the day and then closed again by mid-morning. Because of their prevalence in the Nile Valley, the blue lotus became one of the main symbols of Upper Egypt. Remember, that's in the south. And the bright blue bloom of the lotus flower with the yellow center mimicked the daily rise of the sun in the blue Egyptian sky, a sort of botanical metaphor for the cyclical nature of the cosmos. Just like with the poppy, the Ebers Papyrus is one of the best historical sources for the blue lotus in Egypt. Here we see it categorized more as a poison than a medicine, however. And just like with the poppy, the blue lotus contains alkaloids, which in large quantities are quite dangerous. Our evidence for what the Egyptians were actually doing with the blue lotus is far less robust than with evidence for the poppy. Outside of the Ebers Papyrus, most of our evidence for the use of the blue lotus comes from wall paintings in tombs and temples. Starting in the New Kingdom, we get increasingly frequent depictions of banqueting scenes where blue lotuses are present. We see women harvesting flowers, draping them over wine jugs, and extracting that liquid from them with a cloth press. We then have other scenes in which women pour small vials of an unidentified liquid into large wine bowls. The suggestion would then be that the extract from the blue lotus was combined with wine to add a further psychoactive effect to the drinking of wine at banquets and festivals and religious rituals. In total, the Ebers Papyrus mentions more than 60 herbs and plants that could be used to heal the sick from their ailments. The poppy and blue lotus are simply the most psychoactive of those included. We saw earlier how things like honey or aloe vera could also produce useful effects, even if they didn't have the same dramatic effect on the mind of the narcotic-producing plants. One further takeaway is the vast majority of evidence is relegated to the medical and religious realm. We see relatively few examples of poppies or blue lotuses used for recreational purposes. I guess you could think of them as the medical marijuana of ancient Egypt. And finally, we get to the famous cocaine mummies of ancient Egypt. In 1992, Svetlanata Babalanova, a toxicologist from Germany, published that she had found trace elements of cocaine, hashish, and nicotine in hair samples from an Egyptian mummy dating to around 1000 BC. Normally, this wouldn't be a groundbreaking discovery, but the thing is, cocaine comes from the coca plant, and that plant is native to South America. So how in the world did it ever get over to Egypt 2,500 years before Columbus sailed the ocean blue? Or perhaps more accurately, did it ever make it over to Egypt from South America? First, a quick primary on cocaine. Cocaine is a stimulant derived from the coca plant, which is native to the western part of South America. Indigenous tribes use it as a stimulant, similar to the way we use coffee. And Coca-Cola famously used its extract in its soda from around 1885 to 1903. Just like with the poppy and the blue lotus, it's the alkaloids within the coca plant that contain the psychoactive ingredients. The cocaine on the streets of America today is the result of extracting the cocaine alkaloid and turning it into a salt, which is then snorted, inhaled, and injected. As a stimulant, it leads to a faster heart rate, euphoria, and a disconnect with reality. And it does this in a way that's similar-ish to the way alcohol functions. It inhibits the reuptake of dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine, and because of this blockage, concentrations build up in the brain, leading to feelings of extreme happiness. Now back to their purported presence in Egypt. The 1992 findings of cocaine, hashish, and nicotine were published in a single-page article. You're reading it. But implications of these findings went far beyond a single page. This would have meant that there was pre-Columbian contact between South America and Africa, and that became the major problem most scholars had with the findings. The basis of scientific experimentation is that the results of a single experiment are reproducible. And when a different team of scientists attempted to retest the trace chemical elements of the mummy's hair, only traces of nicotine were found. But nicotine, you say, that's from the New World too, the New World tobacco plant. And on the surface, this might be the conclusion. But a further possible explanation must be mentioned. Several plants, other than tobacco, can produce the alkaloid nicotine. And two of these, Withania somnifera and Opium graveolens, are known to have been used by the ancient Egyptians. As we saw with the poppy and the Blue Lotus, the ancient Egyptians weren't particularly shy about their drug use. It tended to be for medicinal or ritual purposes, and they were happy to portray it in texts, art, and artifacts. No such representations of the coca plant or the tobacco plant exist, which suggests that we should look perhaps elsewhere for another explanation of Baba Lanova's initial results. In sum, ancient Egypt had no lack of psychoactive substances. Beer was probably even more of a staple in ancient Egyptian society than it is in our own. Opium and morphine, derived from the poppy plant, are extensively documented for medicinal use in multiple types of evidence: textual, artistic, and archaeological. And while it's indisputable that the ancient Egyptians held on to superstitious and supernatural beliefs, more than one healing recipe involved animal excrement, they also made real strides in other areas that advanced the science of healing beyond anything that had come before.